Hello and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going to explore the ghosts of Monmouthshire. The ghosts of Monmouthshire, which include phantom stagecoaches, faceless ladies, and even some terrifying tree nymphs that like to break people's arms and legs. And what other podcast gives you terrifying tree nymphs that like to break people's arms and legs? And so, to begin at the beginning. And, as mentioned, this episode is dedicated to Monmouthshire, which I confess I feel like I've neglected this part of Wales a little bit in recent times, so I'll be making up for that on this episode and also on a couple of other episodes coming up later this year. And these tales come to us from a book, or rather, it's more of a pamphlet really, but a book called Ghosts of Monmouth that was first published in the 1960s, and which is effectively a collection of local newspaper stories and strange events from in and around the area. And just as fascinating as the ghost stories themselves, which are coming up very soon, including those nymphs, is the introduction to the book, which was written by a Stephen Clark, because he tells us that he is not a folklorist, he is not a ghost hunter, but he is, unusually for this podcast, an archaeologist. You don't get many archaeologists publishing books about ghosts, but he tells us that it may be thought that ghosts and legends are an unusual subject for an archaeologist concerned with facts. But antiquarians generally are agreed that local folklore should be preserved and recorded. It is with this end in view that these stories are published, and the writer would be grateful to hear from anyone who is able to add to the collection. So, he is not publishing these stories because he necessarily believes in ghosts or wants to give us a good scare, but maybe he does achieve that. But it's because he thinks it's important for local folklore to be preserved. And who can argue with that? Further, he tells us that folklore, as distinct from ghost stories, so works of fiction, often has a factual basis. And the idea here, and the idea in all of these stories, is that maybe they are actually rooted in something real, even if they sound fantastical. Even if you don't necessarily believe there are tree nymphs out there breaking people's legs, and maybe they are. But he believes these things are rooted in something real. And he says, for instance, stories of the traditional fairies of Wales, handed down for centuries in different parts of the country, had many points in common. They feared iron, they lived away from large settlements, often in lake dwellings. They refused to speak intelligibly, and they were very alike in looks. So the fairies of Wales, he is telling us, across the country feared iron, lived away from large settlements, often in lake dwellings, refused to speak intelligibly, and were very alike in looks despite popping up in all these different places. And modern historians suggest that the so-called fairies were in fact original inhabitants of the country who took to living in seclusion after the Celtic invasion. Their fear of iron can be understood when it is realised that the Celts introduced the use of this metal into a land where it was previously unknown, and their refusal to speak intelligibly was due to their ignorance of the Celtic language. So what he's telling us here, as an example, is that the fairies of Wales are not small Tinkerbell-type creatures. In fact, they were real people. They were the original people who occupied the land that we now call Wales. But because they hid away from these new people, because they hid away in caves, because they could not speak the same lingo, because they were scared of these weapons made of iron, they were simply dismissed as, well, what would become known as fairies, or, as we say in Wales, y tylwyth teg. But when it comes to ghost stories, which is, of course, the focus of this particular episode, he tells us that pure ghost stories are a different thing entirely, and Monmouth abounds in them. And he goes on to say that, during the time I have been helping in excavations in the town and the district, I have heard many such stories. Some are first-hand from sincere people who have seen things that seem to defy logical explanation. Others are what he describes as the I know a man who knows a man type stories. And I recall talking to a former mayor of Monmouth who claimed to have seen a ghost in a house in Monmouthshire Street. And if you can't trust the word of a mayor, who else can you trust? This mayor, doesn't name the mayor sadly, but this mayor of Monmouth claimed to have seen a ghost in Monmouthshire Street. And as it turns out, a slight teaser, I will be looking at Monmouthshire Street in a later episode later this year. But to kick off this investigation into the ghosts of Monmouthshire, we are going to start by looking at phantom stagecoaches, which, as the name suggests, are phantom stagecoaches. Stagecoaches that are phantoms. And we are told that phantom stagecoaches figure prominently in many ghost stories told in country districts, and some local spots are reputed to be haunted by such spectres. One coach is supposed to travel the line of an old road, which seems to be a one-time continuation of Waterley Lane through Bailey Pit Farm and over the White Hill to Wanstow Court, where stories of ghosts have often been told. And Wanstow Court, incidentally, which is still standing today, as will be most of the places and streets and things I mention on this episode, because we're not heading back to the Victorian age on this episode. These are only from the 1960s, not the 1860s like so many episodes. But it is still standing today, a 19th century country house, grade 2 listed, if anyone is thinking of retracing the roots of this phantom stagecoach. But to continue, the road is now a dingle through which flows a brook, but the coach is still supposed to run. So run presumably through the dingle and through the brook, so not the typical terrain you'd see a coach, if it was not a phantom coach, that would be hurtling through. These are things only spectral stagecoaches can do. Then, to continue, there is the story of the coach and 4 wild-eyed horses, which travels the old Monmouth Abergavenny Road. On the Monmouth side of Rockfield village, which of course is world famous for lending its name to Rockfield Studios, where so many huge rock bands have recorded over the years. It's where Queen recorded Bohemian Rhapsody. It's where Oasis recorded much of What's the Story. It's where Black Sabbath and the Stone Roses, my personal favourite, not so long ago, the Pixies were there. And actually, without going off on too much of a tangent, I believe there were, maybe it's an urban legend or a practical joke or something, but I'm sure there was some kind of ghost story, some kind of haunting attached to the time when Oasis were recording there. If any Oasis superfans can confirm or deny that for me, answers on a postcard, that would be great. Some might say that Rockfield Studios was haunted, but anyway, back to the story. And on the Monmouth side of Rockfield Village, it is said that the coach rounds a sharp corner and careers into a wall. So it follows this road, and at the end, bang, it seems to go straight into a wall. Now, of course, this could be reenacting something that did happen. Maybe this offers a clue as to some kind of tragedy that may have happened, and that is why we are seeing this repeat itself again and again throughout history. And we are told the coach is only seen on dark, stormy nights, and awestruck witnesses have told how it crashes over the wall and into a field by a stream. No investigation has been carried out, but it would be interesting to find out if there ever was a coach which crashed through this wall in days gone by. And I agree that would be interesting. I mean, this was written in the 1960s, so maybe in the 60 plus years since then, somebody has carried out an investigation. But if not, I know there are many great ghost hunters out there who listen to this podcast, so there is a challenge for you to head to Monmouth, to head to Rockfield, to follow that route of the phantom stagecoach, and while you're there, see if you can find out anything about Oasis being bothered by pesky poltergeists at the same time. Now, let's head to Newcastle in Monmouthshire, of course, not to be confused with any other Newcastles, and I believe I might have touched upon something similar to this a few years ago on an earlier episode. I've done so many now, I've lost track, but either way, I think it's always nice to get a different perspective on something, even if I have covered it in the past. And our archaeologist tells us, well, not the archaeologist himself, but the newspaper he is quoting, tells us that tradition has it that the Moat and Bailey Castle at Newcastle, known as Castell Myrach, the Castle of the Stallion, was the home of many a spirit and, I might struggle to pronounce this one, the Hamadryads. I'm assuming that's pronounced Hamadryads, Hamadryads, which are tree nymphs from Greek mythology. And these are said to be from the Great Newcastle Oak. The Great Newcastle Oak, the last branches of which fell in a violent gale some years ago. Now, these fierce female tree dwellers, so the story goes, lived in the Great Oak for many years and protected their home by casting fearful spells on anyone who attempted to damage it. So if anyone tries to hurt this tree, these fierce female tree dwellers are ready to make them pay. And one villager, we are told, after breaking off a branch, fractured his arm and another his leg. When the great tree was damaged in a storm, one of the largest branches fell and filled 15 carts with firewood. So quite a sizable branch, this one. But the cottages of the villagers who used it are supposed to have caught fire, which I feel is a little bit unfair. I mean, the villagers breaking off branches, you can understand why they get hurt, but somebody who's just given a lump of firewood and then their cottage burns down feels a little extreme. But, you know, if there's one thing I've learned in life, you don't mess with fierce female tree dwellers. And we are also told that, staying in Newcastle, other sprites of the district, however, were much more sociable than these fierce females, and they acted as attendant spirits of the local wishing well and the Seven Springs. So the spirits in Newcastle weren't all feisty females, there were some helpful ones there as well, who liked, it sounds like, to hang out by the water. And the waters of the latter, the local wishing well in Newcastle, were said to cure rheumatism, while girls who threw pins into the wishing well believed their wishes would come true. And if that wasn't enough, there was also a well inside a farmhouse with its own ghost. On several occasions, one lady is said to have seen a phantom arising from its depths, but the well has since been covered over. So wells again in Newcastle seem to be places of activity of a certain kind. But let's move on to our next subject in the Ghosts of Monmouthshire. And the final one for this episode is a nice creepy one to wrap things up with. And this is the Faceless Lady of Hadnock. The Faceless Lady of Hadnock, which is a farmland and woodland area just outside Monmouth itself, on the bank of the River Wye. And we are told that whether one believes in ghosts or not, it is likely that at some time or another, one meets sincere people who tell of unexplained happenings they have experienced. And of course, I can confirm this, when you do what I do, you meet amazing people pretty much every day of the year who tell you stories like this. But back to this one, and one such person, a Mr. C. And this is an example where the person's name has been disguised because, you know, in the 1960s, as with today to some extent, but in the 1960s, nobody wanted to be considered a crazy person who believed in such things. So all we have is Mr. C. C for Charles. Let's call him Mr. Charles, who at the time of writing was still living in Monmouth. Maybe he's still there today, although that would mean he would be pushing around, well, at least 100 years old, but, you know, still possible. But this report tells us that he and a friend saw a ghost at Hadnock in their younger days. And what follows is a first-hand account, which means the words I'm about to read you, the story I'm about to tell, will be in the words of Mr. Charles himself. And he says that one summer day, nearly 30 years ago, two friends and I set up a tent on the banks of the River Wye at Hadnock. During the evening, we walked to the edge of the woods and, as boys do, laid a couple of makeshift rabbit wires. And just to interrupt quickly, but rabbit wires, if you aren't familiar with them, are wire snares used to trap rabbits, which thankfully are far more regulated nowadays, but it was the 1960s, and we walked back to camp and settled down to play cards. The game went on until after midnight, and then one of my friends suggested we should go to see if we had caught anything. It was a very clear night, and although there was no moon, the starlight was sufficient to see our way. We entered a field on the side of the wood, when suddenly the figure of a lady appeared a few yards to our left. The apparition was of a hazy, bluish colour, almost transparent. Her long, flowing dress was drawn in tightly at the waist, and she wore what seemed to be either a tall hat or perhaps a high hairstyle. And just to interrupt again quickly here, I do love this description of this woman, or this apparition of a woman, who appears to be dressed quite glamorously for somebody walking around on the banks of the River Wye after midnight. This flowing dress, tight at the waist. Yet she is walking around where the boys are trying to catch rabbits, not the most sensible of places. And she's wearing either a tall hat, which would be typically Welsh. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the traditional Welsh costume, a tall black hat. It's not usually paired with a cocktail dress or whatever she might have been wearing, but nevertheless, it is traditional, and it was the 1960s. Or maybe it's just her hair. She has this big beehive, or maybe a bit of a Marge Simpson look going on. But either way, back to it, and she moved across our path. Her movements were quite silent, for she appeared to glide rather than walk, and I do not recall seeing her feet. One of my friends was also watching her, and we noted that she did not seem to have a face. This was a faceless, glamorous woman. But my other friend was obviously bewildered by our stares, not by the apparition, but by us, for he could see nothing, and the two of us watched as she faded away, rather like a puff of smoke. Afterwards, the two of us who had seen her compared notes, and his description, my friend's description, fitted mine. But we could not understand why she should have appeared only to two of us, only to two-thirds of the party, and not to the third member. And I have to agree, I mean, there are many sightings out there where one person sees something and nobody else does, or vice versa. There are sightings where everyone sees something. It's quite unusual for 2 out of 3 to see something, but after which the writer of the piece adds, and it's something I would add as well if I was writing this piece, it would be interesting to know if anyone else has seen this ghost, or if history can tell of any tragedy in these fields which might account for the restless spirit of this lady of long ago. Now, again, I'll throw this challenge out there to the amazing roving ghost hunters listening to this podcast. If you are going to head to Monmouthshire to retrace the route of the phantom carriage, to go and see if you can find out if Oasis really were spooked while recording in the studio, maybe you can add this to your list as well. Go and find out if there's any records of a lady, faceless or otherwise, who may have been mixed up in some tragedy at this spot on the side of the River Wye. And if you do, be sure to let me know. I might even join you, or include it on a future episode. And on that note, we have reached the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button, and you will never miss an episode ever, including the other Monmouthshire episodes, which will be coming up later this year. At least 2 more Monmouthshire episodes this year, maybe more, who knows. If you really enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast going forward, you can always treat me to a coffee via my Ko-fi page. There's a link to that on my website. It's always very much appreciated. And if you'd like more ghosts and folklore, you can, of course, follow me on social media. And I've published a number of books about similar weird and wonderful subjects, which are available from all good bookshops, offline and on. Always support your local bookshop where possible. And if you would like signed copies, get in touch and we will do our best to sort that out for you. Now, before I let you all go, I should say quickly, this is my first episode in a while. I did upload an update a few weeks ago with all my reasons, all of my excuses in, which was also a video, which must have been a surprise for people on YouTube. If you don't follow me on YouTube, which I know is most people listen to this on Spotify and Apple and things. But there are some things I can only do in video. In fact, I'm filming something very exciting next week. So if you do follow me on YouTube, you will see some extra stuff. But I just wanted to say a huge thank you for bearing with me. It has been a bonkers start to the year, but I am back on track. I've ensured I have mapped out the rest of the year, so there should be no more excuses, no more delays. We should be all good up until December. And if that wasn't enough, there are lots more talks and events and things in the pipeline, not just with myself, but also with the Paranormal Unpacked team, which again, if you haven't seen that, check out the Paranormal Unpacked channel on YouTube, where the Ron the Street Poltergeist video, our first sort of full-length documentary, has done ridiculously well, actually. We are very, very pleased with how well that's gone down, so lots more Paranormal Unpacked videos on the way as well. Anyway, more on that soon. It just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if you do go ghost hunting in Monmouthshire, you will definitely maybe encounter a glamorous woman with a large Marge Simpson-style hairstyle, who we are told might well live forever. Oh, and don't get yourself caught in a rabbit wire. Until next time. No star.